Good morning, Damien.
Thank you very much for joining us on. I'll talk about Belarus in a minute and about, I suppose, the difficulties there. But talk to me, please, if you wouldn't mind, about your take on COVID passports, restarting international travel set to operate in Ireland from mid-July, new guidelines. What's your thoughts, please?
Not very complicated at all, Damien. What will happen is Europe will open and we'll watch what's happening and we'll row in 4 to 6 weeks later. That's where the movable dates, depending on whom you're listening to, Leo Varadkar, Micheál Martin, Stephen Donnelly, Eamon Ryan have all had come up with different dates, but they're really looking at a time lag. Once Europe starts moving, and as you might expect, Southern Europe is much more enthusiastic about opening up than Northern Europe. Portugal and Greece have led the charge. Spain, I was in Madrid for the big tourism announcement last Friday by Pedro Sanchez that from July the 7th, or from June the 7th, Spain will be opening. And all of the countries, when they say opening, it usually means dropping things like self-isolation. No other country has the hotel quarantine that we have, but the self-isolation and also the negative test is being kept by some of them, because the big white hope, I was going to say, but the big green hope that is looming over travel this summer is this green certificate. If you're vaccinated, it'll be on the equivalent of your boarding pass on your phone. You scan that in at the airport, no questions asked. And the big question is for people who are not vaccinated, because obviously it comes the older people vaccinated first in every European country, and it's not so much the $6,000 question as the $89.99 question, because that's what a PCR test costs in most countries in Europe now.
Yeah, and again, this has to be fully talked out, I suppose, like whether the person is vaccinated or has a negative test for COVID or has had the virus in the last 6 months. And are you envisaging are you telling me, Eoghan, we really don't know what's going to happen yet?
We don't know what's going to happen. And the reason we don't know is the European Commission has done really well. And as you well know, Damien, from your long years covering the European Commission, nothing happens fast. This happened really, really quickly. And now the member states are lagging. All of them are going to have to look at it. And what the European Commission is being firmer on this time than they were last October with the famous traffic light system is they don't want a la carte stuff, member states picking and choosing what bits they want. They've said it's got to be implemented in 6 weeks. So what really there are a lot of grey bits between the green, and one of them is that question of, if you're not actually vaccinated, will a PCR test be still required? And the other thing is, we have a very complicated Rubik's Cube of regulations right across Europe from place to place. Some countries, under 16, it doesn't need to test, under 18 in others. In Ireland, in our case, it's 6. And then some are requiring 72 hours, some are requiring 48 hours. The European Commission trying to get back this notion that we lost in March of 2020, that we're one economy, that we're effectively one great community of 27 nations, because that all fell apart once the rates started rising in Italy. They're trying to get that back with the green cert this summer. And there are a lot of questions to be answered, as you just alluded to.
So let's say, for example, let's take 3 scenarios. You can lump them all in together if you want and give me an overall thing. People texting in. So I have relations in England. Will people from England be able to come over and visit me? Let's say I have a friend who has family in Spain. Will she be able to go back and visit her family in Spain? Will they be able to come to her? Or if I want to go to Italy for a week during the summer, what do you think?
I think once you're vaccinated, and obviously the vaccinations are rolling very, very fast, all of those questions will be answered with a yes. The real issue is that, families, young parents and children over the age of 6 start complicating things. As it stands, there's another complication, by the way, Britain not being in the European Union, and there's we're not in the Schengen travel area, and we're in a common travel area with a country that has just left the European Union. Even without COVID, that would have brought a whole set of complications. As it stands, it's asymmetrical. I think that's the word that a few few angry Tory MPs were throwing around the House of Commons that the Irish going to England don't have to self-isolate, whereas the British coming here have to self-isolate. So that's that's as it stands. You need your test in certainly coming back into Ireland, and you need to self-isolate coming back into Ireland. That's as it stands.
So as it stands,
in the other direction.
Sorry for interrupting. As it stands, if I went over to visit my relations in London and Muswell Hill, I'd be able to stay for a couple of weeks. If I came back into Ireland, even though I'm vaccinated, do I still have to self-isolate?
Absolutely. The vaccination does not exist as far as Ireland's COVID regulations on travel, international travel, stand.
Okay, and in terms of holidays in Spain and Italy?
PCR both directions as it stands, slightly cheaper in the Spanish side. It tends to be about 50 or 60 euro. And really important, we have to wait for public health policy in Ireland to allow non-essential travel. As it stands, it's effectively illegal, and they have a guard at checkpoints on the road to the airport, and they also have a guard to look at your boarding pass and passport as you go through, just before you go through security in the airport, to ask you, is it necessary travel? So don't even think that it's possible to go on holidays until that is changed. That's probably something that will change first in the whole sequence of events. But as I said at the very beginning, it's going to be Europe first, then us watching, particularly figures, rates, all of that as they across Europe. Spain will allow you, and Portugal will both allow you in as it stands with a PCR test. They're watching Ireland's rates. Our 14-day 100k, which is the international metric, is around 120. Britain's is down to around 50. Ours could tumble quite a lot as the vaccination rolls out. That's been the experience in a lot of countries. And once we're going below 100, last year people were saying 50 would be the metric. Germany introduced a metric of around March of 150 being, because the European average was very high. It's down to about 220 now. But now I think once our rates begin to tumble back towards the 50, and that's the metric you're looking at, not the average number of cases every day that's announced, but what the 14-day for 100,000 population, that will decide whether countries want us in or not without a PCR test. I do see complications. I do see that you will need the vaccinated people will be clear to go, and listeners will be familiar with those memes of grannies dancing on tables in Ibiza because they were the first to be let back in.
So, and of those grannies, so a granny and her son and his wife, and they're over the age of 50. They're vaccinated. Those three people are vaccinated. They want to bring their two children, 14-year-old Ben and 16-year-old Sandra, at the end of June after the junior cert or leaving cert. They can't even get to the airport at present, and if they do go, they'll have to get another PCR test when they get over there before they come back. Let's
really important. Nothing of what I'm talking about is in place where as it stands, you still need the PCR test for everyone going, vaccinated or not, going into Spain. But what I'm talking about is how the summer will look when it starts. And I do expect the ban on all but essential travel to go. There's different signals coming from different ends of the cabinet on that. But for everything else to happen, that needs to go first. Now, you really put your finger on it. There is very little likelihood. And remember, Spain, I was with the tourism minister on Thursday night, Fernando Valdez, who, it is an interesting aside, Damien, is that Pedro Sanchez and Fernando Valdez both learned their English as teenagers in Ireland. Listeners will know all those great, wonderful Spanish students that all came over and we all fell in love with in our teens.
Yes.
But Fernando and Pedro have these lovely little Irish idioms that they use in press conferences when they're speaking in English that nobody picks up except the Irish journalists. But anyway, Fernando was saying that over 6 is going to need a negative PCR test. I don't see any circumstances that children are going to be vaccinated across Northern Europe with the big Spanish inbound markets, because it's such a big ethical question with Africa waiting for vaccines. So I don't see any circumstances that children and teenagers, between the ages of 6 and whatever the vaccination is, getting their digital green cert without having a negative PCR test. And that adds basically €200 to every teenage holiday. So that's one of the big questions, hasn't been confronted. I mean, there's a lot of euphoria that travel is opening again, but there's going to be that middle, it's not even a midlife crisis, it's a pre-midlife crisis point between the vaccination age. Let's say the vaccination comes down to 40 or 35 even, but between 6 and 35, we're going to still leave that group, that cohort of people that will need a negative PCR test.
I'm going to let you go because this interview has gone on a bit too long, but I have to ask you obviously about air travel in Belarus and the scandal and the shock. And it's like, you've been covering the airline industry for decades, Eoghan. It's unbelievable what happened, isn't it?
It's unbelievable, but it was coming, and I'll tell you why, Damien. International airspace was being weaponised. It should be sacrosanct that anyone flying from Europe travels through Irish airspace without any political interference. We've seen it happen. We saw the Americans. There's a lot of kettles and pots here. We saw the Americans do it with, people, a journalist on a no-fly list because he covered Cuba on an Air France jet. The Air France jet having to divert. We saw
when
it
was
with
that,
Qatar
by the way?
Versus Saudi. About 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay, yeah, right.
And we saw it with Qatar versus Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia refused overflights. Now, it's been increasingly weaponized, and the international community hasn't done enough to stop it. Hopefully, this will be the turning point. And it must be said that Ryanair did really, really well. They did very well to deal with the crisis in the start, and also to get their aircraft out after 6 hours. And in the way they set up, they debriefed crew and dealt with their passengers afterwards. Ryanair has an incident room for a major event. It's the first time it had to be deployed. It's a huge issue for an Irish airline. But it all goes back to something that has been creeping into aviation, using international airspace to weaponize. And we've seen other countries, messing around with. They have access to who's on every aircraft, and we have seen other using to score political points. This is the most extreme example that we've seen, and hopefully, like all extreme examples, it'll help to roll things back a bit.
Eoghan, I'll let you go. Listen, Gura Míle Mágat Slán go fóill. Thank you very much. Good to talk to you.
Míle Mágat, Damien.